Good morning, everybody. Hello. Quiet in the back. My name is Jonathan Last. Some of you know me from previous Broadmoors, from previous Weekly Standard cruises. I'm now the digital editor of the Weekly Standard. I've been in the magazine for 20 years. It's the only place I've ever worked. And it's because it's a great place. It's a great magazine. Bill Crystal, Fred Barnes, like surrogate fathers to me, and Steve Hayes, who's now our editor-in-chief, is like the older brother who I never had, and he's a dynamite reporter and a great editor and a really great leader. I want to thank you for coming here this morning to the Broadmoor. Thank our sponsors, the Future Female Leaders of America and the American Conservative Union. We have a tremendous program for you this morning. We're going to start just a few minutes with Senator Ben Sasse, and before that, to kick things off, let's all welcome the Weekly Standard editor, Steve Hayes.
Thanks, man. Thank you. Morning, everybody. Have your coffee? Me too, I need it. Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you all for coming. We are very excited about this program this weekend. We think we've got a first-rate program, and it doesn't get any better than our first guest here today. I wanted to just take, before we begin the formal program and have the discussion with Senator Sasse, I wanted to just take a minute, in part because I got so many questions about this last night at the cocktail reception, and give you kind of an update on the state of the Weekly Standard and where we are. As Jonathan mentioned, I took over in January as editor-in-chief, and I know from having spoken to some of you that you were worried that Bill Crystal might be going away, and I'm happy to report that he's not going anywhere. He's been, as you know, from reading the magazine, writing editorials pretty much every single week. I talk to Bill 4 or 5 times a day to get some guidance on what the heck I'm doing with this job. For 20 plus years, Bill made being editor of the magazine look effortless, and I can assure you it's not effortless. It takes a lot of effort. But I'm happy to have Bill around to continue to help guide and shape the magazine and our vision going forward. As Jonathan said, he took over as digital editor of the magazine just a couple weeks ago, and obviously, we see the digital side of the magazine as a place for real growth and reaching young conservatives across the country. And putting Jonathan in charge of that has allowed me to sleep again through the nights, which I wasn't doing before that. We also have had the opportunity in recent months to build the staff. You may have noticed this as you've read the magazine over the past few weeks. We've added some new writers and some new editors. And we think we've gotten fairly lucky with the people we've been able to bring aboard. We brought on Robert Messenger, who was the books editor at the Wall Street Journal and took a sleepy books section at the Journal 7 years ago and built it into the powerhouse that it is today. We brought aboard Peter Boyer, who was the lone conservative voice at the New Yorker magazine. He was there for about 20 years and then was a senior executive at Fox News. We brought aboard Tony Messia, who is the deputy business editor of the Charlotte Observer, who's covering economics and the business world for us. We brought on Rachel Larimore, who was the managing editor of Slate magazine, which is a left-leaning magazine, but she was the sort of token conservative at that publication. And then we brought on a young reporter named Andrew Egger, who is a recent graduate of Hillsdale College just this year, and we were told was Hillsdale College's finest young writer. And we got him, and he's proving those recommendations right. So we're thrilled about the direction of the magazine. We're not changing the direction of the magazine. What you're going to get with the Weekly Standard today and going forward is what you've gotten from the Weekly Standard, just a little more of it. So we think that'll make everybody happy, and we're pretty thrilled about where we are. The reason that we were able to do this is because of the generosity of our owners, Phil and Nancy Anschutz, who are here today and have provided us with these additional resources in order to allow us to expand what we're doing and to continue not just to be a participant in the national debate about these important issues, but really to continue to lead the debate in the country, to help shape the debate about the future of the country and the kind of things that we care about so much. So, and a special thank you to Phil and Nancy Anschutz for all of their support for us. We are delighted to have Ben Sasse here. I'm going to have Jonathan come back up and do the formal introduction of Ben Sasse, and we're going to start that conversation momentarily.
I cannot even tell you how excited I am to introduce our first guest, Ben Sasse. Over the last couple of weeks, my wife has been reading his book, The Vanishing American Adult, and so I will get text messages from her all through the workday with, and then on page 47 he says this. And at first I thought, well, this is really great. She wants to share with me what she's reading. And then I realized, no, she's indicting me with his words. She's like, why can't you be more like him? He's a real man. So Senator Sasse started out as he worked in consulting, then worked in the Bush administration, first the Department of Justice's Office of Legal Policy, then eventually Health and Human Services, then finally he left Washington, thank God, and went out to become president in 2009 of Midland University, and he saved this college. He turned it around, and literally this thing would have gone out of business if not for him. He was elected to the Senate in 2014. He's already written a real book. I don't know if you guys understand this. Us writers make distinctions between BS books and real books. And this is a real book that he's written. It's already a Times bestseller. I think people are going to read it for 10 years from now still about what is wrong with the culture and what is wrong with perpetual adolescents like me. He is, I really can't say enough about this. He is basically the conservative Daniel Patrick Moynihan. He is the first senator we've had in America who is a genuine public intellectual, probably in a generation. I am thrilled to have him there. Seeing him in the Senate makes me proud of America every day. Please welcome Senator Ben Sasse.
Thanks.
How are you?
I'm good. It's good to be with you. Jonathan's words were nice. I kind of want to meet Jonathan's wife. And it's good to be with you. I'm excited about it. I think my mom's more excited, though. Like every 68-year-old woman in America, she has a crush on you.
I did not pay him to say that.
If you've ever been in an airport with Steve Hayes, I've never traveled with Steve, but I've just run into him in an airport 2 different times. He has groupies. It is absolutely amazing. And they're all my mom's friends.
If I would have known this was coming, we would have rescinded the invitation. So let me share with you details of an intimate late-night email I got from Senator Sasse. It's not as interesting as it sounds. I got this email at 3:44 in the morning today. Morning, Steve. I just arrived. I had some flight bumps, but all good now. Headed to the hotel, we'll grab a few hours of sleep. See you at 7:59 a.m. So first, thank you for making the trip. Senator Sasse was at the baseball game, the congressional baseball game last night, and came out afterwards, which explains why he got here at 4 in the morning and is working on 3 hours of sleep. So I'm not going to go easy on you just because you're tired.
Fire away.
Okay. So as Jonathan said, I can't recommend this book highly enough. I knew sort of what the book was about and was interested in the subject matter. And then we had Senator Sasse to an off-the-record meeting at the Weekly Standard to talk about the book. And I can't tell you anything that he said because it was an off-the-record meeting. And I actually keep those vows when we make them. But it was an absolutely fascinating discussion and one of the most interesting sessions I've had with anybody in any capacity in Washington, D.C. in the more than 2 decades that I've been there covering politics, in probably a company with only one other of those kinds of sessions that we had, and it was with Justice Antonin Scalia. So, thrilled to have you here.
Thanks.
Let's get right to it. Why'd you write this book?
A bunch of reasons. I'm a father. My kids are 15, 13, and 6, and we were, reflecting on how we're parenting. What do we think we might have a theory that's right on, but we're not executing well enough? And what are the places we sort of need to work on theory? So that's one. Number two, I was a college president for 5 years, from 2009 to 2014, and I'm a business turnaround guy by background. And Boston Consulting Group, McKinsey & Company, private equity. I've worked in a lot of sectors where things were on fire and falling apart. And so I was called in at 37 to take over this 130-year-old liberal arts college in Nebraska. Nobody thought they were hiring me because I had any insight into student affairs or student life or student culture. I was there because this place was going to go bankrupt. It wasn't student life that I was supposed to fix, and yet that's what I was losing sleep about every night, sort of 6 and 9 and 12 months into my time at the turnaround at this college. I was just constantly unsettled by what I was seeing in student life. And I want to be clear, this is a constructive project. 2/3 of this book are exclusively forward-looking. What kind of habits are we trying to form in our kids, and how do we think about their coming-of-age experiences? This is not an old man screaming, "Get off my lawn." Like, this is not a beat-up-on-the-millennials book. But I think that what I saw in the experience of 18 to 22-year-olds, and again, I was 37 when I became a college president, I didn't think of myself as very far removed from going off to college, 18, 19 years before that. And yet, the fundamental distinction between students that I was seeing as late teenagers today and what I'd experienced 2 decades before is I grew up in a working class ag manufacturing town. I live in a farming community an hour outside of Omaha. We live in the same place where I grew up. And everyone I knew graduating high school in 1990, everybody, whether you're going to college or not, and everybody I went to school in Boston, everybody I got to college with, whether they were from a rich family or if they're from a working class, poorer family like mine, everyone I knew had worked. And the overwhelming experience of kids now, when you're 18, is the vast majority have never done any real work of any kind. And so the historian in me wanted to make sense of what it means to live at a time in economic history where we think teenagers are really not sort of needed economically, and therefore we just kind of let them drift. And that distinction between production and consumption isn't in their belly, and we're not shaping it enough. And so they grow up with most of their lives as, 8-year-olds, 10-year-olds, 12-year-olds, 14-year-olds with consumer categories, not sort of early proto-production categories. And I'm worried about that for the Republic.
Why is it important?
America believes that most of the interesting things about us and about our people are about what you love, and they're about your habits, and they're about your appetites, and they're about your community, right? Most of America is not about our government. Government creates a framework and preserves a framework for ordered liberty, which is another way of saying freedom from bad stuff, so that you can be free to go and build great stuff. Families and neighborhoods and churches and synagogues and venture philanthropy and the great new entrepreneurial activities and the next app that's going to change the world. We believe that what you do in a republic are the things that you go and pursue with your freedom. They're not the compulsory collective projects of our government. And yet if we don't think of ourselves as a republic of workers, then you start to turn back on yourselves and start to think that politics might be the center of everything. I think politics is a means to an end. Politics is definitely not interesting enough to be the end. And I think we have a conversation which is turning toward government in ways that are really, really dangerous. And some of it has to do with the transformation of our understanding of work.
So that's why it's important for the future of the Republic. Why is it important for individuals to work? I mean, if you've got wealthy parents and you can sort of glide and have fun through high school and college, why shouldn't you do that?
I think work is one of the most fundamental anchors of human identity. Work clearly is a means to an end. Work is a way to make money, to store labor, and be able to provide for yourself and your family. But work is so much more than that. We could have big, long historical and philosophical and theological debates about work. But just to reduce it to something real pragmatic to get us all on the same page, sociologically now, there's a lot of data about happiness. And if some of you know Arthur Brooks, he talks about this a good bit too. But over the last 10 to 15 years, there have been thousands of articles written on what makes people happy. And what's really fascinating about it is how simple the literature ends up being. I tend to think that economics is really the only social science, and all other social sciences are sort of just ideology and humanities masquerading as some sort of soft science. But when you look quantitatively at what studies have been done on what drives human happiness, there are only 4 variables. It's really kind of interesting. You might think there are 80 or 500 if you're asked in the abstract, what things drive whether or not people are happy. Besides genetics, and it turns out about half of your happiness in life tends to just be driven by your genes. So it's kind of all mom's fault. But except for that, which you obviously can't control, there are only 4 things that drive whether or not people are happy. Do you have a family? Do you have any friends? And this is not sort of 200 or 1,000 Facebook friends. This is, do you have 3 or 4 real friends in the world, Aristotelian friends? People that are happy when you're happy and they hurt when you hurt. Kind of the way we feel towards our kids, right? When my 13 and 15-year-old daughters or my 6-year-old son, when something good happens in their life and they're happy, I'm happy. And when they hurt, I don't choose to hurt. I just ache because I love them, right? That's what friendship is. It's an expansive sense of the self where you start to envision and feel someone else's goods and ills as your own. So number 1, family. Number 2, do you have any friends? You only have time in life probably to have 3 or 4 or 5 friends. You can't have 20 real friends. I mean, of course, we use the term generically, and I'm not beating up on the sort of linguistic way we use the term friend, but do you really have deep relationships? Number 3, do you have a framework to make sense of death and suffering? We're mortal, we're gonna die. It's scary as hell, and most people hide from it. But if you have a framework to make sense of it, it's a key driver of whether or not you're happy and content in the world. But number 4, and again, this is what's data-driven, because if I were rank ordering them based on my beliefs, I would have probably started with a lot of those 3. But number 4, by far the biggest driver of human happiness is, do you have meaningful work? Fundamentally, it is the closest correlate to whether or not people are happy is when you leave home on Monday morning and you had to go somewhere, to the office or the field or to travel as a salesperson or whatever your calling is in the world. When you leave home on Monday morning, do you think you're needed? If you do, you're almost certainly happy in life. And if you don't think you're really needed, you're almost certainly not happy. It's an amazing correlation. And this isn't, do I think I make enough money? This isn't, does my back hurt at the end of the day? Is there some annoying person 3 cubicles away who talks too loudly? But do I think I'm needed? If I'm needed, you probably are happy. And right now, we're not teaching our kids that. We're really teaching them that more consumption will make them happy. And there's no data that shows that. Like consuming more and more just doesn't make people happy. It's a crazy curve, actually. I'll stop here. I'm far afield, abusing Steve's kindness.
Keep going.
But it turns out going from really, really poor to having enough food so that your belly doesn't hurt when you go to bed at night, sort of abject poverty around the world, people get a little bit happier when you're not hungry. That's true. For the rest of the curve, though, it's really flat to slightly declining. The more resources you have, it gets a little bit harder to be happy at almost every stage, going from lower middle class, from sort of working class to lower middle class to upper middle class to wealthy. And I think why that is part of our contentment in life is kind of a fraction of a numerator of needs met over a denominator of perceived needs. And we tend to think if we just work a little harder to get more stuff to meet our needs in the numerator, we'll be happy. But the far more reliable path is to try to shrink your denominator and convince yourself you don't need, not everything that you want is actually a need. And so if you just yearn for more and more stuff, what tends to happen is we tend to get a little bit less and less content because we grow that denominator. Thomas Jefferson reflected on this a lot. And I think the shorthand way to think about it is when you get a faster computer, it feels really good for the first 2 or 3 weeks, because all of a sudden the speed of the thing, and I know our computers are so fast now, but think about your phone downloading something. But really, 15 years ago, when you'd upgrade your desktop computer, as it got a little faster, it made you a little happier for a few weeks, but then from then on, what it really did is have a one-way ratchet that set your expectations so that when you're visiting your sister and you use her slower computer, you're like dying at how terrible this thing is. And so our kids are needed, and we believe sort of existentially they matter. They're created with dignity, and they're made to be workers, and we have to teach them how to work. And yet we're raising our teenagers because we don't need them, right? Objectively, economically, almost all of our families are fine without the labor of our kids, and they feel that they're not needed. They're less and less happy, and we convince them, just pursue consumption categories, and that'll meet your needs. And it doesn't. It leaves them feeling like they've consumed cotton candy for weeks on end.
Yeah. Connor. My son is sitting down in the front. Did you hear that, Connor?
Connor actually came up to me outside. He was really polite. He introduced himself. He made eye contact. He shook hands and everything. And then he said, "I don't like you. I had a summer plan that was going to be great, and now my dad's shipping me out to the fields." Didn't really happen. But.
No, but we have, as a result of reading your book, we have had, we've built into our schedule work weekends. So last weekend we worked from noon until 6:30 cleaning the garage, including all the dust and cobwebs and everything. So Connor, meaningful work is the key to happiness. Will you tell your sisters that when they get here, please? So let me push you a little bit on this. Please. You say that you're not, sort of a young curmudgeon yelling, "Get off my lawn," but you kind of sound like one. And isn't this the case? I mean, we hear this from every successive generation. I mean, my mom used to tell stories about walking backwards uphill through the snow to get to school.
No shoes.
And every successive generation does less work and doesn't have it quite as tough and aren't you just like becoming a curmudgeon 30 years before it happens?
No, that is, so for people who, I'm not here to try to sell books though, please, love freedom and buy the book. But for people who haven't looked at it at all, 1/3 of it is stage setting, right? So you could make 20% of the argument Steve's making in the first third of the book, because we just need to recognize that all sorts of things are happening with this rising generation that are new. Something like 40% of 18 to 24-year-old males spend half of their waking hours playing video games. Scares the crap out of me, right? Like I have 15 and 13-year-old daughters, and I'm kind of wondering who they're going to marry someday, because I don't think I want it to be somebody who's spending half of all of his waking time playing video games. The number one address for people when they graduate college now is to move back into mom and dad's basement. There's nothing wrong with having an intentionally intergenerational household, but that's not really what we're dealing with right now. So I use 9 or 10 kind of 2-page summaries of different kinds of data to set the stage for how the coming of age experience for these kids really is different than in generations past. But this is not, and 2/3 of the book then is constructive. What do we do about it? How do we love and serve our kids better than this? But this is not a blame-laying book. But if it were, I'd be beating up we, the parents and grandparents, not the kids, because they're growing up at a unique time in human history, and it's our job to think through what our obligations are to actually help them come of age, right? They're growing up at the richest time and place in all of human history, and that is a great blessing, right? They don't live in abject poverty. They don't live in a war-torn civilization, despite a lot of kind of ways that we consume media, which lead us to have deeper, immediate experiences of things like violent crime. Violent crime is at an all-time low in recorded history, like across the world and in US cities. There's just lots and lots of things that are great about this moment, and yet there is a downside to being raised with so much material surplus and wealth that they don't have natural coming of age experiences that are necessity driven. And why that matters, I think, is because we're locking a lot of our kids accidentally into this category of perpetual adolescence. And I think it's useful to distinguish between adolescence, which is a special gift, and perpetual adolescence, which I think is a hell. I think, we forget that Peter Pan was a dystopian hell. Like Disney has tried to remake Peter Pan like it was a great thing to be stuck in this teenage, not quite adult, but no longer kid phase of life forever. It's a terrible thing to be stuck in Neverland. Peter Pan has an adult body and he's killing people, but he has no memory, he has no moral sense, he has no history, he has no future, he just sort of drifts. And I think lots and lots of our teens are stuck in Neverland, and that's perpetual adolescence. That's the bad thing. Adolescence is a pretty great thing. The concept is only about 2 millennia old, and it's this idea that just because you hit puberty, you hit biological adulthood, doesn't mean you need to go and become fully independent right away. We don't expect our kids, just because they're 12 or 13 or 14 and hit puberty, they don't have to be financially independent, emotionally independent, morally independent. They don't have to quit school. They don't have to form their own household structure. All that stuff is a pretty great blessing. I think of it as an 18-month to 4-year greenhouse phase between childhood and adulthood. So again, you're bodily hitting adulthood, and yet we give you this extra space to be protected as you form in the rest of the resilience of your character with people who want to shepherd you and help you. But adolescence is a means to an end. It's not a destination. And right now, we're letting it become a destination. It's really hard in lots of our communities to tell 10 and 15 and 20 and 25-year-olds apart. That's really bad for 15 and 20 and 25-year-olds, and it's bad for the Republic.
Isn't it the case that as we look at kind of the nature of work, particularly in America today, and the technology that we've seen introduced over the past 3 decades, and the birth and growth of artificial intelligence, and the kind of things, the kind of advances that we've seen, that when we look forward 15 or 20 or 30 years, this problem is likely to be worse?
Yeah.
I mean, there will be less of the kind of shaping work that I think you're describing here.
Yeah, I think that's true. I'll cite 2 center-left thinkers for a minute, so I'll see if I can get in trouble with our mixed audience. Bill Gates talks about this as the first intra-generational economic disruption or crisis in human history. Almost all past macroeconomic disruptions have come over the course of decades, so that what really happened was one generation continued doing what they had done, and they realized that the next generation was going to have to organize social and economic structures differently. The disruption that we're entering now, and let's say we've been in it for 20 or 30 years, and we're going to be in it for 50 to 100 more, but we don't have categories to talk about it, and I'll try to unpack a little bit of what I think is happening. But the disruption that we're going through now is going to transform our economics inside this generation that's coming of age. When they're 40 and 45 and 50, they're going to get disrupted and disintermediated out of not only their jobs and their firms, but their whole industry. We're going to have to create a civilization of lifelong learners, and that's never been done before. And we're going to need to do it because 40 and 45 and 50-year-olds are all of a sudden going to be in certain industries, and then they're not going to exist anymore. And they're going to have to get retrained. We've never had to deal with that. That's sort of a Bill Gates frame. A Larry Summers frame on this is that we've got 7.2 billion people on the earth. We're going to have 9 billion people by the year 2050. And right now you got about 4.5 billion workers. As we go from 7 to 9 billion people, we're probably going to go from 4.5 billion workers to maybe only needing 4 or 3.5 or 3 billion. We might be entering a world where lots of people won't ever need to work. I think that's really, really, the sort of global economic productivity, great news. The implications for the human soul, really dangerous. There have only been 4 kinds of economies in human history at the macro level. Hunter-gatherers, settled agrarian farming, industrialization, mass urbanization, mass immigration, the sort of transformation of first world societies from 1870 to 1920, and this fourth thing. Hunter-gatherer, agrarianism, industrialization, and what? We don't even know what to call this, right? We sometimes call it the information economy, the knowledge economy, the IT economy, the service economy, the digital economy, the mobile economy. Sociologists have recently just given up, and they now call it the post-industrial economy, which is another way of saying it's the after the last thing, right? But we don't call industrialization the de-agriculturalizing economy, right? We came to understand it as the big tool economy of industrialization in cities. Well, if you think about social and human capital and the sort of anchors of place and the anchors of human identity, hunter-gatherers had really extensive nomadic understandings of how their communities and their kin and kith networks worked. Agrarianism was the sort of Tocquevillian village that is where America came from, right? Industrialization scared the crap out of people that America might die because you might not have the same Republican virtues, I mean small r, not partisan, but Republican virtues that made American self-reliance great, and Yankee ingenuity, and sort of pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, and the sense of frontier, self-survival, self-resilience, self-discipline, self-control, self-restraint, deferred gratification, all these values of the Tocquevillian village. In a bipartisan basis, people thought America was dying when we transitioned from Category 2 to Category 3. Republican Teddy Roosevelt, Democrat Woodrow Wilson, both agreed this won't work. We're going to need experts to rule us now. Happily, they were wrong. And when you got to cities, we recreated dense social networks. Urban ethnic neighborhoods ended up being a lot like old villages. And it turned out that there was a lot of communalism. Again, not politics here, but local communitarianism, a sense of neighborliness, love of neighbor, accountability, transparency, virtue as something we valued. But why they were scared is something we should reflect on. They were scared because work was disrupted. Hunter-gatherers and farmers, again, I'm not talking about like high-tech ag in my sector in Nebraska now. I mean what farming looked like when 86% of the public did it. As recently as the American Civil War, 86% of Americans lived and worked on the farm. By World War II, 60% of us lived and worked in cities. What they thought was happening, when you'd never had job choice as hunter-gatherers or as farmers. You just did what grandma and grandpa had always done. You didn't come of adolescent age and pick a new career or vocation. You just became 8 or 10 or 12 and you did more to earn your keep, and then all of a sudden you could do it in a self-sufficient, independent way. What they were scared about was that disruption in the nature of work. And as the father of teenage girls, I get why 15 to 25-year-old males migrant across the landscape would scare the crap out of people, right? Like, that's what was happening as people left the farm and went to cities. But when they got to cities, it turned out we recreated dense social networks in urban ethnic neighborhoods because you only had job choice once. You moved from the farm to the city, or you graduated high school and you went to the factory and you kept that job till death or retirement. What's happening now is going to be endless job reshaping for a whole life. We've never had a multiple career life, and all of our kids are going to have to do that. Self-reliance is going to be more important 20 years in the future than it's ever been in American history past, and at exactly that moment, we're trying to bubble wrap our kids. Last fact on this point. In the 1970s, I was born in 72. In the mid-1970s, average duration at a firm was 2.5 decades. What do you think average duration at a firm is today? 3.8 years and getting shorter every year, right? When our kids are 40 and 45 and they get disrupted out of their jobs, they're gonna have to find new ones. No one's ever had to do that before. By and large today, if you're 50 and you get disrupted, you mostly don't ever get employed again. Right? The opioid crisis, which wasn't on anybody's radar 10 years ago, is in many communities in America now. When you do qualitative polling, what are people scared about? The opioid crisis is #1 a lot of places in America. This is an echo of middle-aged job disruption and joblessness, I think, primarily. And people think they might not have meaning if they lose their job. All of us are going to have to raise our kids and grandkids to be able to go through that disruption many times in their lives. On that happy note,
Sounds great.
Anybody got whiskey?
Sounds great.
There's a lot of opportunity there. Like, it can be great.
It's true. We'll get to why you're optimistic, or why you're telling us to be optimistic. I do want to do a couple. Even the bigness of this discussion makes the discussion of our politics and what's happening in Washington today feel sort of small, but I do want to get there. I think maybe the best way to transition is for you to tell the story about the ranch. And when you were campaigning all around and thought that you were going to get political questions, and you didn't really get as many political questions.
That's really good. So our kids, again, 15, 13, 6. And, or as we call it, girl, big gap, providential surprise. I still remember when my wife came to me pregnant with our third, she's like, I'm pregnant. She's sobbing, and I'm comforting her and hugging her and loving her. And then I'm going out in the garage, and as soon as the door shuts behind me, I'm just fist pumping so big. But until she stopped throwing up 10 weeks later, I never admitted that our emotions on this were really divergent. Anyway, our 15-year-old daughter was 14 last spring, and I'm one of 5 people in the Senate who's never been a politician before. I'm the only commuting dad in the U.S. Senate. So I live in Nebraska. I go back and forth every week. Have 3 kids, and I get home on Friday afternoons most weeks, and my wife tells me which kid annoyed her most that week, and they become my date for the next week. So we just rotate who travels with me. I won't give you which of my kids it is, but one of them happens to be my date about 70% of the time. So we go back and forth, and we have lots of work for our kids because they have the hybridized schooling experience. They do lots of different kinds of things. But when they travel with me, they've got some work they're supposed to do. Our 13-year-old gives all the tours to Nebraskans who might be visiting D.C. in any given week, and our 15-year-old helps write legislative mail and correspondence, and then they've got jobs back in our house. And yet still, like all of your kids and grandkids, there's not a lot of necessity that's really compulsory in their life, and I was worried that my 14-year-old was feeling like she was demonstrating the behaviors of a spoiled 14-year-old kid. Pardon me. And I wanted her to suffer. right? I mean that in a good, loving way. Like I mean, I don't want her to suffer as punishment, but I wanted her to understand necessity. And so Nebraska is the largest cattle state in the union, and we lived on a campaign bus for 16 months when we were running for office. I did about 1,000 events across Nebraska's 93 counties over 16 months living on this bus. And so we got to know a lot of ranchers. And ranching is really, really hard work, especially in cow-calf season. So there are 3 phases of a cow's life, and I won't bore you with what they are, but that sort of first phase when a baby cow is born, it's born at 50 to 120 pounds. And in Nebraska, the gestation cycle and when artificial insemination happens, most of the babies are going to be born over about a 6-week period that's sort of a long march, right? And March in Nebraska is still often really miserable. I mean, you can be below 0 a lot of March, especially when you're out on the plains and, big winds and no trees, and you can suffer. Well, it turns out when a cow's going to be born, you have to match it with mama right away. You have to get it tagged early or you lose about $300 because all the stuff you're trying to do with the genetics of how you do breeding. You can't have 2 cows give birth near each other and not know which cow came from which mama, or you're going to lose a bunch of money in your accounting system. You also have the dangers that these cows can get frostbite. And so, especially if it's a first-time mom and the baby might not latch right away, and you got to dry off the ears that are all wet and they can freeze and fall off. So there is work to be done at 9 p.m. and at midnight and at 3 a.m. and at 6 a.m. You got to go out and drive these huge ranches in a pickup and look at all the cows and try to figure out how to match which baby with which mama. And so I asked one of these ranchers, could my daughter just be labor for you for a month? And he was ecstatic, like just to have a free 14-year-old. And so we shipped her out there, and it was, I mean, in Nebraska you can drive at 14, so she had just recently learned to drive, so that part of it wasn't the biggest deal, but they're giving her this old Ford F-150 and turning her loose to save all these baby cows in the night and feed them, and it's hard. And you have to don a rubber glove to your shoulder, it turns out, because sometimes you assist in the process. Some of you are still eating, but I won't give details, but you can lose a watch. And so my daughter and I, we commute together a lot. I love this kid. She's becoming a friend. She's not just my kid. She's, in an Aristotelian sense, somebody that she's a delight to talk with. And yet, she was going to go through a lot of 14-year-old teenage girl ick stuff over the course of her month on the ranch. And so she's texting me all the time. And it's not really whiny. It's just sort of descriptive. But the way she's describing it, a lot of it has to do with poop. And so as I get her texts to me, I realize this is just too good to let this stuff pass with just me. And so I start converting them to tweets. And so if you're on Twitter, I'm at Ben Sasse, just my name. It's me, it's not my staff. I'm a commuting dad raising kids on the road. And that's really what drives me, and I'm a sports addict. And I'm a one cheer for politics guy. Politics is not the center of my identity, and so it's not what I think about most of the time. I've got a day job, but it's not the greatest thing in the world. And so I don't tweet much about politics. I just tweet about raising kids and sports and whatever. And funny stuff that happens when you're raising kids on the road. And so I made up this hashtag from the ranch. And every time my daughter texted me, I just tweeted it out. And all of a sudden, this stuff goes completely viral. Reporters are calling me, and the Wall Street Journal wants to go out and follow her around, a teenage girl getting a coming-of-age, work ethic experience. And I really didn't think very much of it. I'm probably tweeting 3, 4, 5 times a day, whatever crazy stuff she'll say. This is March of 2016. Some of you may remember 2016 was a presidential year. And it turned out both parties decided to nominate people that I had some concerns about. And I tended to be fairly direct about what I think about the long-term challenges of the Republic, and I was critical of the nominees of both parties. And it turned out in Nebraska, where I would say that I would call Nebraska reluctant Trump for a while. So the sort of ceiling when there were no longer 17 candidates, but 5, 4, 3 candidates left. Mr. Trump really never got up to 40% support in Nebraska. But all of a sudden, it was pretty clear by late March, early April, that he was likely going to be the nominee. And a whole bunch of people went from reluctant Trump to just anti-Hillary, right? So the number one driver of this moment was binary choice, pro-Trump. And so there were a whole bunch of people who were pretty frustrated with me for having said that I was skeptical of both of these candidates. And so I went to do a bunch of town halls and travel across Nebraska in April and May, and I really thought I was going to get shellacked because of how frustrated people were with me about us having a slightly divergent view of the now president. And almost everywhere that I went in Nebraska, the only thing anybody wanted to talk about was my daughter on the ranch and how their kids could suffer too. Like literally, I mean, people would just, throngs of people would gather around me as I would try to leave events, and they're like, we're not getting out of the doorway until you give us that rancher's cell phone number. I got a kid, I can't get him off the video games, and we're shipping him to that guy. And I realized Nebraskans really do believe what I believe, which is the really important stuff in life is well upstream from politics. And obviously the 2016 election was and is a big deal. But what people really cared about is how are we going to raise our kids to be self-reliant, independent, fully contributory adults in 25 years?
Well, it does feel small to go to politics after poop and the ranch.
Turns out there are some commonalities.
Yeah, maybe it just flows. Let's bang through a couple of these real quick. We'll do this as sort of a lightning round. I want to have an opportunity to take at least a few questions from you all for Senator Sasse. Healthcare. House passed its version. The Senate has not. There's some question as to whether that's going to happen. Have you seen the Senate bill?
I have not.
Has anybody seen the Senate bill?
I doubt it.
But there's talk that it might
We're off
pass.
the record, aren't we? All of a sudden I'm nervous.
Well, I'll try to be gentle and still extract important information. There's talk that that bill could pass before July 4th, and here we are in the middle of June and nobody's seen it. Is that what Republicans criticized Democrats for doing back when Obamacare was passed? And is it a good way to legislate?
I wasn't there. I was elected 29 months ago. But I'm pretty sure there might be some tape of Republicans criticizing Democrats for passing a bill that people hadn't seen and hadn't been scored. We don't take a long-term view on much legislatively in Washington, and that's a big problem, right? I mean, we have generational crises piled up right now. This is a time where, though I am a very small government guy, I'm the third most conservative person in the Senate by voting record. I believe in Tocquevillian localism and in markets and decentralization. But you do need federal government for some stuff. And we're sort of living on a chassis of 1965 in Washington, and a lot of our legislation is really obsolete, and we should be doing real reform for stuff that is 10 and 15 and 25 years future looking. And healthcare is a pretty good example of something where Obamacare is terrible, but it is totally insufficient for we Republicans to simply say what's wrong in healthcare is that Obamacare is bad. Because though Obamacare has caused and exacerbated far more problems than it's addressed, the reality is we did need healthcare reform in 2009. Obamacare was just the wrong way to do it. And so we need to be able to explain what was wrong in American healthcare in 2009, not just scream Obamacare's bad. And I think the simplest way to think about what's wrong in healthcare is, first of all, the American people, when you poll them, and again, I have a sort of Burkean sense of my calling, so I don't make decisions on what I'm going to prioritize and spend my time on based on polling, but just as a matter of instruction to understand where we are. Most Americans are far more concerned with premium growth, which continues to grow at 2 to 2.5 times inflation growth, than they are with uninsurance. But just when you distinguish both of these problems, what Obamacare said it was going to tackle, I mean, ultimately it claimed utopian, eschatological, heavenly problem solving. Remember, it was going to reduce premiums $2,500 per family. In point of fact, it's raised premiums $3,200 per family. So they were only off $5,700 per family. But just set aside what they claimed about prices and costs and premiums for a minute and just talk about it on insurance. So this is kind of problem 2 in most Americans' thinking. What drives growing uninsurance in America? When you ask people, most Americans have been led to believe that we have growing uninsurance in the country because we have poorer people or we have sicker people. Socioeconomic status or health status and pre-existing conditions. These things are just not true. What drives growing uninsurance in America over the last 25 years? Basically, uninsurance has been growing since about 1990. Why is there more uninsurance in America? Because we change jobs faster. And by far, the number one driver of uninsurance in America is job change. We go back to that point about changing firms every 3.8 years. The average American has a 4 to 6 month period of uninsurance every time they change jobs. Well, right there, out of 320 million Americans, if you take 6 months over every 4 years, you get to tens and tens of millions of uninsured people because of while you're changing jobs. That's not a small problem. I'm not minimizing it. That's a giant problem because it means you don't really have insurance. Because that's when you get the breast cancer diagnosis, or that's when you have the car accident, when you're changing jobs. And now all of a sudden, you're a part of the pre-existing conditions population of 5 and 10 and 15 years in the future. If you go by health status right now, there are probably about 3.5% of Americans that are uninsurable because of health status. Again, 3.5% of 320 million people, that's about 10 million people. We could completely solve that problem. You could solve that problem in ways that I don't like. You could have a very heavy-handed, governmental, centralist solution to the 10 million people, and we could afford that. What we can't afford is having 40 and 50 and 60 million people 10 and 15 and 20 years in the future that are uninsurable because they have a pre-existing condition. Well, that's what happens when you have all these gaps in your insurance. We should be solving the real problem, which is we should get to an insurance system where American families can buy the insurance that they want, not some all Cadillac bells and whistles policy that a government bureaucrat mandates. They should be able to buy the policy they want, and it should be able to go with them across job and geographic change. Why can't we do that? Because the tax code is biased toward large firms from an accident from the late 1940s, wage and price controls at the end of World War II. Again, I won't nerd it out on why. But we're not tackling the big stuff. Democrats are trying to put Band-Aids on every problem and say that wherever there's a problem, there must be a federal governmental one-size-fits-all solution. And Republicans are wanting to say Democrats are bad. Neither of those are going to get us to mobility.
Yeah. Quickly on national security, and then we'll take a few questions. The cliche question about national security, I mean, you're on Senate Armed Services Committee, you've established yourself as a sort of big thinker on national security issues already. The cliche question is, what keeps you up at night? I think given the scope of problems that we're seeing when we look across the world today, maybe the better question is, how do you sleep at night?
I have a theological framework to make sense of death and suffering.
Put it this way, when we're watching the news, what should we pay careful attention to as it relates to looming threats, national security problems?
Maybe just, let me give you a top 4 or 5. Cyber, and cyber.
What about cyber?
Cyber is underappreciated as a threat. I want to say a little bit something about what cyber means. Again, I'm a BCG McKinsey guy by background, so I'm good at interviewing people. I'm good at going into an organization that's broken and admitting, hey, I don't know anything. Help me learn how we should prioritize your organization, your company, your not-for-profit, your governmental agency is trying to do 100 things, and no organization's ever going to do more than 8 well. So let's concentrate on the big 3 or 4 first, and then figure out if we've got time to get to 8. But let's cut the tail off priorities 9 through 100, because we're going to distract our focus. We're not going to have executive leadership on things. And so I go in and interview people. I've done 24, 26 crisis and turnaround projects the last 2 decades. And so when I go in, I start asking my questions, and then I pull up and I say, hey, by the way, let's not make this like a game of Battleship where I just miss by a little bit in the way I frame the question. Will you help me? Help me frame the question better than I'm framing it. What should I be asking you? Every day, I'm in the SCIF almost every day, the SCIF, classified bunker. I read intelligence every morning, and I bring in national security experts. So super spies and generals and government experts who used to be super spies or generals. And I interview them for 5 to 10 minutes in an hour meeting, and then I'll say by minute 10, I'm stopping now, help me. What are you losing sleep over? No one takes a breath. Nobody who knows this space well, no one takes a breath before they just say, oh, cyber. Cyber is going to transform the nature of our warfare within 5 to 10 years, and we're completely unprepared for it. You can't, I'm a historian by training, so I tried to look at nuclear doctrine, offense and defensive nuclear doctrine development from the 1950s to 60s to 70s. There's no metric by which you can look at where we are in cyber against nuclear and not just say this is exponentially harder and we're spending exponentially less on it, money, but mind share, focus as well. That's the bigger problem. We've got 5 major geopolitical threats in the world: Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and sort of a catch-all category of jihadis, right? All 5 of these categories have the hundreds and hundreds of engineers working right now to plot future cyber attacks against us. And you can never play defense sufficiently against cyber, and we'll never be able to play offense in the same way that we did deterrence with nuclear policy, where there was a major barrier to entry to becoming a nuclear state. And if somebody became a nuclear state, we could go to them and say, hey, by the way, here's what mutually assured destruction means. And so if we ever think you're about to fire on us, we're going to annihilate you. You may kill us all. We're not going to be able to play defense against incoming nuclear weapons. Obviously, Star Wars has evolved over time in the way we think about it, but for the doctrinal 42 years or whatever, however we want to name the Cold War, we could go to nuclear powers and we could say, we know we can't play defense, but we want you to understand our offensive capabilities. We'll never be able to do that the same way in cyber because there are so many attribution problems. So the barriers to entry to becoming a cyber warrior are much, much lower than nuclear. And the sense that when they attack us, they might make it look like somebody else did it, means that our deterrence is going to be really, really hard to assure somebody we would respond in kind rapidly enough. And so we're entering a world where I think it's almost a certainty that we're going to have a massive cyber attack inside the next decade. And we don't distinguish between civilian and military targets in this space the way, or we are failing to recognize that if there's an inbound ballistic missile toward Washington, D.C., and we say, well, maybe it's not headed toward Washington, D.C., maybe it's not headed toward the Pentagon, maybe it's headed toward an office park in suburban Maryland. We don't go, oh, well, then it's not our problem. We're the U.S. government. That missile, it's just going to hit our citizens and our businesses. We don't need to deal with that then. But in cyber, that's kind of how we're acting. We're saying that the Sony attack, well, that wasn't a U.S. government target. Well, most of the bad guys who want to level cyber attacks against us, they're not mostly focused on hitting governmental targets. They're mostly focused on hitting civil society targets. And we're not at all prepared to deal with this. And then I'll stop here so Steve can take us to questions. But when you overlay information ops and propaganda on this, the biggest weakness in America right now is American doubt about what America means. And the bad guys want to figure out ways to exploit American on American doubt. The crisis of public trust is a battlefield now. What comes next is lots and lots and lots of propaganda that's going to make Republicans and Democrats who are fighting on a health care bill start talking about each other. And by the way, I think Obamacare is really bad. I think it's a really troubled piece of legislation. But Democrats who have a different view of healthcare than I do, they're not the enemy. They're Americans. And we have to start by recovering a sense of what the First Amendment means and what the American idea is in common. And the bad guys want to exploit American on American doubt, and that's their greatest asset.
That's well said. Brooke, do we have time for 2 questions? Great. Questions? In the back there?
Thank you very much. Okay, I'll be real brief. A comment and a question. Comment: if you do multiple regression analysis of survivability and health, the amount of money that's spent on medical costs does not even make the top 10. It's exercise, eat, what you do for a living, where you're born, genetics, et cetera. So it's always bothered me, this marketing thing of referring to medical insurance as health insurance, as there's almost no connection. My question has to do
Before
with...
your question, I have a book table for 15 or 20 minutes right after this. Would you come to me? I would love to just get any data you have. I believe you. But when you cite regression analyses, I'll add it to my repertoire if you'll come talk to me, please.
I'm sorry, I've got to go to Taco Bell. I don't remember the paper. I'll see what I can do. Okay, number 2.
Everybody needs 4th meal.
Right. Number 2 is on EMP, because I lose sleep about the cyber business as well, But EMP is one place where we could have a defense. And I'm sure you're aware of how the North Koreans could drop a missile from a satellite, pop one on each coast from a boat, take out our electrical power grid. We'd have 80% fatality from starvation in 30 days. And there's a simple solution. It's about $1 billion of current limiters in our substations around the country, and instead we're spending that money on these stupid windmills to chop up eagles. When is Congress going to put this EMP protection in?
That's a big question.
Just to back up, EMP stands for electromagnetic pulse. There is as big a gap, I would say, between experts who are concerned about this and reporters who mock it, as I have seen on any issue at all.
I know I've given many monologues in response to a number of questions, so I won't do it here, but let's just flag really important question, and I bet the Venn diagram of what you're worried about and what I worry about overlap a lot. It's also possible that we have a few places where we diverge, so instead of trying to give a long answer, let me just admit that there's probably a category where I do think there's some hyperbolic stuff out there in public view that I'm skeptical of. It may not be the stuff you're citing, but I do think there's a huge exposure here. And one of the things we just haven't thought through is, I don't want to get anywhere near current intel, but there are people in the intel community that are gaming out lots of different types of EMP attacks that could be leveled against us. And we're decades behind where we should be in preparing for lots of threats that could be very cataclysmic. And maybe I'll just stop there, but say that the problem here is at a macro level, the little bit that we're thinking, and there are cyber means to EMP attacks, right? They're not just dropping bombs. There are ways to get to EMP attacks via cyber. And if you sort of think about all the sectors of our economy that could be exposed, from different kinds of energy and electricity and transportation and financial services and telecom and governmental service delivery, there are bad cyber guys who want to think about attacking us in all of those ways, and these are multi-layered problems. We don't have an offensive or defensive cyber doctrine. We don't have human capital competence in the legislature or in most of the executive branch. The executive branch knows that we're behind on planning and plotting for cyber, but they're caught in turf battles that are decades old. And I'll stop by saying this. When the internet was blowing up a whole bunch of different businesses in 94, 5, 6, 7, I would regularly go in with the new CEO of a company for 3 or 6 months as he or she would arrive somewhere, and we'd think about what's going to happen to your business model because of this thing called the World Wide Web and electronic commerce. Those were the two terms we used a lot in the mid-90s. And I remember going into a big regional Bell phone company in 1996 and having the CEO say to me, "Holy crap, I'm over my head. I don't know what I'm doing here, but I got 100,000 employees, and I think that I've become CEO of a phone company. A bunch of people are telling me that because of convergence, I need to become a bank. I don't know what that means. Number one, what is electronic commerce? Number two, do I have to develop banking capabilities? And number three, I find there are 17 divisions here that do e-commerce. I got 100,000 employees and 17 do e-commerce. Here's the first thing I need from you." And he said to me and my Boston Consulting Group team, he said, "I need the 5 of you to spend the next 90 days and come back to me and tell me, do I fire 16 of my 17 teams that do e-commerce? Or do I fire all 17 and start over?" That kind of question is the kind of question that people who know how to execute executive leadership in a time of strategic crisis act. We don't have anybody anywhere in the government who knows to think that way about offensive and defensive cyber doctrine. And a lot of what you say fits in as a subset of how would we do some defense to different types of attack.
So go buy stock in long-term food preparation, food canning companies. Let's do one more question over there.
I'm also a turnaround guy, and I'm in the cybersecurity business, and I've been trying for 6 months. I've been working through your good friend John Thune in the Commerce Committee, and I've emailed Brian's previous, and I've been trying to get a short meeting with the right people on cybersecurity, and bring together some Silicon Valley cybersecurity people that would really be helpful dealing, and you're a if I could have 3 minutes after the meeting, I'll connect with you and we'll talk about what we can do. I can get some of the best people working on this problem, and that will resonate with what you're saying.
Thanks very much.
Good, thank you. Alex, we'll do that last one.
I had a question. Is this working? Yeah, okay. I have a question about, you talked about raising our children to be self-reliant. Well, what about the businesses? I mean, we're talking about the EMP possibility and cyber warfare. What are our businesses doing in America to prepare for that?
Good question. So I think let's distinguish between two things. In a way, it's a way to bridge between his comment and your question. We're going to need Silicon Valley to be able to this is sort of a Manhattan-like project, except bigger and harder. And so we will never run this through monopolistic government organizations and sufficiently prepare for the disruption of what cyber warfare brings next. So clearly there needs to be public-private partnerships. And again, my bona fide is third most conservative guy in the Senate by voting record, et cetera, et cetera. There's no way we're ever going to prepare for all of this without having a diverse set of inputs and human capital and brains and competition, which means there's going to be a private side to this, and the government is going to have to facilitate the conversation such that I would say individual business entities can't possibly sufficiently defend themselves against an attack from a nation state that targets them. So it is a governmental responsibility, I believe, to figure out what there's some sort of governmental umbrella here. That doesn't mean government solves every problem. Lots of phishing attacks, phishing attacks, are because of bad cyber hygiene, right? Like at a basic level, and I don't come out of IT. I'm a historian by training and then did a bunch of business strategy and then was a college president. I'm not an IT guy. I'm not a technician, but I'm obsessed with these categories, to Steve's point about what do you lose sleep about. And something as basic as two-step factor authentication, like there's really no excuse for any of you who are running business enterprises to not have your enterprise with two-step authentication, because it makes it so much harder for the bad guys to get in than if there's just a one-step way they can hack into your systems. So obviously cyber hygiene is not a governmental responsibility. But when some country, we still got lots of problems about the way we do the classification, but let me just say, it's been widely reported, I'm not affirming or denying, it's widely reported that North Korea hacked Sony. Sony can't possibly be prepared to respond to nation-state attacks. And we have lots of nation-state attacks in the future against private sector stuff. And we're going to need a whole new way of thinking about public and private sector. And we need, maybe this is a way to close, I'll give a final word to the boss here, but I mean, a way to wrap yours back to the self-reliance point of today. Washington needs to do a smaller number of bigger things. And if government were focused on the right things, we would be able to have the broader civic conversation about what America means, which is pre-political and pre-governmental. What American exceptionalism means is that we're blessed to live in the most interesting nation in the history of the world, not because we're ethnically superior to other people, right? Remember when President Obama got the question in 2012, do you believe in American exceptionalism? And he sort of awkwardly aches as he pauses, and you can see the gears turning in his head. And you know what's really going through his head is, oh no, I don't believe in American exceptionalism. I don't want to answer this question. And yet it's a campaign year, and I know I'm supposed to say, yes, I believe in American exceptionalism. And so he says, yeah, I believe in American exceptionalism. And he sort of shrugs, like the Greeks probably believe in Greek exceptionalism, and the Brits believe in British exceptionalism. That's not what American exceptionalism means. American exceptionalism is an understanding that what happened in Philadelphia in 1787 was historically unique because we, our founders, flipped on its head the relationship between rights and government. Most people, most places in human history had said that government gives you rights. We said that people have rights and they have inherent dignity. We have equality by nature, and government is just our shared project to secure those rights. And so there's a pre-political sense of human dignity in America that makes government merely our shared project to secure certain rights. And so if you have an ethos of the First Amendment, if you believe in free speech, press, religion, assembly, protest, right? If you believe in those things, what you're really saying is America's a creedal nation. And we believe in human dignity. And what's really interesting in life is the things you fall in love with. It's the kids you raise, it's your neighborhood, it's your friends, it's your entrepreneurship. Not just for-profit entrepreneurship, though obviously that, but it's your venture philanthropy, it's the Rotary Club. That's the meaning of America. And once we understand that together, then we can come together under this umbrella of civic understanding of human dignity and the American idea, and then we can have the smaller legislative fights about what the limits are between the governmental role in some sectors versus others. But right now, we have a hollowing out of local community, and we have a politicization of national conversation, so that many people are projecting tribal hopes onto politics. The 535 people I work with were way too lame and uninteresting for anybody to project grand hopes and dreams on. And yet we have a whole bunch of people who seem to be finding their identity in politics right now. That's not American.
Wow.
Thank you very much.
Let me just say before we get to some, we went way over time. We've blown through our schedule.
Sorry.
And this is the first thing. But you can understand why I wanted to do that, I think. You know, we spoke about a lot of things and a lot of concerns, both cultural and political and global and in terms of national security. And there are a lot of reasons to be concerned or pessimistic, but I think we can probably all agree that one reason to be optimistic is that we have somebody like Ben Sasse who's helping to think about these things. So thank you very much for making the trip. Senator, I don't know if we've blown through the entire time, but Senator Sasse has agreed to sign some books in the back. So we're going to take a 15-minute break here that we hadn't really planned on. We will gather again in 15 minutes, and then we will motor through to lunch. Thank you.